The first time I refused to kneel, every conversation in the room died. I still remember the sound that came before the silence. Silverware clinking against fine china. Crystal glasses catching the warm glow of chandeliers. The steady ticking of a grandfather clock that had stood in Moretti Estate longer than most people had been alive. I was carrying a tray of coffee through the east dining hall when Mrs. Whitaker, the head housekeeper, stopped me with a sharp look. "Grace," she whispered, her voice tight with warning. "He's here." I didn't need to ask who she meant. Everyone in the estate knew who he was. Damien Moretti. Owner of the mansion. Owner of half the city, if rumors were to be believed. A man whose name traveled through hallways like a storm warning. The other servants immediately lowered their eyes. Some stepped aside. Others straightened their uniforms. The atmosphere changed in seconds, as if the entire house had taken a breath and forgotten how to let it go. Heavy footsteps echoed from the marble corridor beyond the dining hall. Slow. Measured. Confident. I had worked at Moretti Estate for almost 2 years, yet I had only seen him from a distance. A dark figure crossing balconies. A black SUV disappearing through iron gates. A silhouette behind office windows glowing late into the night. Today was different. Today he walked directly into the room. I looked up before I could stop myself. Tall. Broad shoulders beneath a tailored black suit. Dark hair brushed neatly back. Calm green eyes that seemed to notice everything at once. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't frowning either. He simply looked like a man accustomed to being obeyed. Around me, servants lowered their heads even further. Mrs. Whitaker gave me a desperate glance. I knew the rule. Everyone did. When Damien Moretti entered a room, staff were expected to show respect. Most bowed their heads. Some offered a small curtsy. It had always felt strange to me. Respect should be earned, not rehearsed. So while everyone else lowered themselves, I remained standing. The tray felt heavier in my hands. My heartbeat tapped against my ribs. But I stayed exactly where I was. The silence grew. Damien stopped walking. For one impossible second, his eyes locked onto mine. The room froze. I realized I was the only person looking directly at him. Mrs. Whitaker looked ready to faint. Someone dropped a spoon in the kitchen beyond the doorway. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Damien studied me. Not angrily. Not even surprised. Just curious. As if I were a puzzle piece that had somehow landed in the wrong box. Then something unexpected happened. He nodded once. A simple acknowledgement. Nothing more. He continued walking through the dining hall without saying a word. Conversation slowly returned. Breathing resumed. The estate came back to life. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Because as Damien disappeared down the corridor, he glanced back one final time. And in that brief look, I felt a certainty settle deep in my chest. The most powerful man I had ever met had noticed me. And somehow, that frightened me far less than it should have. The next morning, I convinced myself I had imagined the entire thing. People like Damien Moretti did not spend their time thinking about women who carried coffee trays through hallways. They certainly did not notice servants. That was what I told myself as I tied my apron and pushed through the swinging kitchen doors just after 6 o'clock. The scent of fresh bread filled the air. Pans rattled. Cooks shouted orders across stainless steel counters. Everything felt normal again. Until Mrs. Whitaker called my name. Grace. I turned and immediately knew something was wrong. She held a clipboard against her chest so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Mr. Moretti requested additional staff for tonight's charity dinner. I nodded. The estate hosted events constantly. Wealthy guests arrived. Expensive cars lined the driveway. Servants worked twice as hard. Nothing unusual. Then she cleared her throat. He specifically requested you. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. Me? Mrs. Whitaker gave a short nod. You will assist in the West Ballroom. The words should have felt like an opportunity. Instead, they felt like a spotlight. The entire kitchen seemed quieter. Several employees exchanged curious looks. I forced a smile. There must be a mistake. There is no mistake. Her expression softened slightly. Just do your job and keep your head down. Keep your head down. If only she knew how impossible that suddenly felt. By sunset, the estate looked transformed. Crystal chandeliers reflected golden light across polished marble floors. Fresh flowers lined the grand staircase. A string quartet tuned their instruments near the ballroom entrance. Guests began arriving shortly after 7. Men in tailored suits. Women in elegant gowns. Laughter drifted through the halls like music. I carried a silver tray filled with sparkling water and moved carefully between conversations. Every few minutes I caught myself scanning the room. Looking for him. Which irritated me more than I cared to admit. Around 8 o'clock, the crowd parted near the ballroom entrance. Damien had arrived. He moved through the room with effortless confidence, greeting investors, community leaders, and business partners. Everyone seemed eager for his attention. Yet somehow, while speaking to a group near the fireplace, his eyes found mine across the room. My stomach tightened. He looked away first. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt confused. An hour later, I stepped onto a quiet service corridor to catch my breath. My feet ached. The evening seemed endless. I leaned briefly against the wall and closed my eyes. Most people are afraid to look at me. The voice came from only a few feet away. My eyes flew open. Damien stood at the end of the corridor. No crowd. No security. No audience. Just him. My pulse stumbled. I am sorry, sir. I did not realize anyone was here. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. You are the only person in this house who never apologizes for looking me in the eye. I stared at him, unsure what answer he expected. Finally, I shrugged. Maybe because I see a person instead of a title. The silence that followed felt enormous. Damien studied me again with that same curious expression from yesterday. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. Quietly. Genuinely. As if I had said something nobody else ever dared to say. And in that moment, standing beneath the soft glow of a corridor lamp, I realized something far more dangerous than being noticed. Damien Moretti was beginning to remember me. Sleep did not come easily that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Damien standing beneath that corridor lamp, looking at me as though I had said something nobody else ever had. By morning, I was irritated with myself. I had responsibilities that mattered far more than the owner of Moretti Estate. The alarm on my phone buzzed at 5:30. Outside my small apartment, the November sky was still dark. I pulled on a sweater, grabbed my bag, and headed across town before reporting for my shift. There was one place I visited every Tuesday and Friday without fail. St. Anne's Medical Center sat 12 miles from the estate. The building was older than most hospitals in the city, but it was clean and filled with people who genuinely cared. I stepped into room 214 carrying a paper bag of muffins and a forced smile. You are late, a familiar voice said. I laughed softly. 3 minutes late, Ethan. That hardly counts. My younger brother grinned from his hospital bed. At 16, Ethan still managed to look optimistic despite spending more time in medical facilities than most people spent in movie theaters. The heart condition he had been born with required constant monitoring and treatments that seemed to generate bills faster than I could pay them. You brought Blueberry? He asked. Of course. His smile widened. That smile was worth every extra shift I worked. Every sore muscle. Every sleepless morning. We spent nearly an hour talking about school, basketball scores, and his dream of finally returning home permanently one day. I never let him see how worried I really was. Hope was easier to carry when shared. By the time I arrived at Moretti Estate, the sun had climbed above the trees surrounding the property. The mansion gleamed beneath the pale autumn light. Employees moved through the grounds preparing for another busy day. I was arranging fresh flowers in the East Library when I heard voices drifting through the doorway. 2 housemaids stood nearby. They lowered their voices the moment they noticed me. Too late. I had already heard my name. "I am telling you," one whispered. Mr. Moretti spoke with her. "That does not mean anything." "Then why has he asked about her schedule twice?" My hands froze around a vase. Asked about my schedule? That made no sense. Damien had an empire to run. Important meetings. Important people. Why would he care where a servant spent her afternoons? The answer arrived less than an hour later. Mrs. Whitaker appeared at the library entrance holding another clipboard. "Grace, Mr. Moretti would like you to assist with inventory records this evening." I blinked. Inventory records? In the main office. The flowers nearly slipped from my hands. Servants did not work in the main office. That part of the estate belonged to executives, lawyers, accountants, and Damien himself. Yet judging from Mrs. Whitaker's expression, there would be no arguing. As evening approached, I found myself standing outside a set of dark wooden doors on the second floor. My pulse beat steadily against my throat. Through the glass panels, warm light spilled across polished floors. I lifted my hand and knocked. A calm voice answered immediately. "Come in, Grace." The fact that he recognized my voice before seeing me should not have mattered. Somehow, it did. The office was quieter than any room I had ever entered inside Moretti Estate. The thick carpet softened every footstep. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound books and framed photographs that revealed almost nothing about the man who owned them. A fire crackled softly in the stone fireplace. Damien sat behind a massive walnut desk, reviewing documents beneath the warm glow of a brass lamp. He looked up as I entered. "Close the door, Grace." My fingers tightened around the folder Mrs. Whitaker had handed me downstairs. I obeyed and crossed the room carefully. "You requested inventory assistance, sir?" His expression shifted slightly, almost amused. "You always call me sir. You are my employer." "That is not the only thing I am." The answer caught me off guard. Before I could respond, another knock sounded at the door. Damien glanced toward the entrance. "Come in." A man in an expensive navy suit stepped inside. He looked to be in his early 40s, carrying himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being important. The moment his eyes landed on me, however, his expression changed. Not curiosity. Judgment. He looked me over briefly before turning back to Damien. I did not realize staff attended executive meetings now. Heat crept into my cheeks. I immediately stepped back. "I can leave." "No," Damien said calmly. The visitor raised an eyebrow. "Interesting." He moved closer to the desk. "The board members have already arrived downstairs. We should discuss tonight's proposal." Damien nodded once. "We will." The man glanced at me again. "Perhaps in private." Every word felt deliberate. Not openly rude. Just dismissive enough to remind me exactly where I stood in his eyes. A servant. Someone who belonged in hallways, not offices. I lowered my gaze toward the folder in my hands and prepared to excuse myself. Before I could speak, the man smiled politely. "No offense, Miss Grace Parker," I replied. "Of course. No offense, Miss Parker, but conversations at this level can be difficult for people unfamiliar with business." The room grew still. I had heard versions of that sentence my entire life. People with more money. Better schools. Better addresses. Always finding elegant ways to say the same thing. "You do not belong here." I swallowed the sting and forced a smile. You are probably right. The man looked satisfied. Damien did not. His eyes remained fixed on the visitor. Calm. Unreadable. Dangerous only in the way a thunderstorm feels dangerous before the first drop of rain falls. Then he spoke. Grace manages inventory records for an estate larger than most corporations. Silence. She coordinates staff schedules more efficiently than several department managers I have hired. The visitor's smile faded. Damien continued. And unlike many people in this city, she knows the value of every dollar she earns. The words landed softly. Yet somehow they carried more weight than an argument ever could. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Nobody had ever defended me in a room like this. Especially not someone like him. The visitor cleared his throat. I did not mean any disrespect. Good, Damien replied. Because none was warranted. A long silence followed. Finally, the man nodded and shifted the conversation back to business. But I barely heard the rest. Because for the first time since arriving at Moretti Estate, I realized something important. Damien Moretti was not merely noticing me anymore. He was choosing to stand beside me. And somehow that felt far more dangerous than standing alone. The rain began sometime after midnight, tapping softly against the tall windows of the estate like impatient fingers. I was finishing paperwork in the servant's office when Mrs. Whitaker appeared in the doorway. She looked exhausted. The florist cancelled for tomorrow's luncheon, she said. The delivery truck broke down somewhere outside Albany. I glanced at the schedule. The luncheon was less than 12 hours away. Important guests were attending. Everything had already been planned. What are we going to do? I asked. Mrs. Whitaker rubbed her temples. I do not know. After she left, I stared at the empty floral order sheet for several minutes. Then I quietly picked up my coat. There was a 24-hour flower market nearly 8 miles away. If I drove there now, I could return before sunrise. It was not my responsibility. Nobody had asked me. Yet something about leaving a problem unsolved felt wrong. 3 hours later, I was standing in the ballroom arranging fresh white roses while the first rays of morning sunlight slipped through the windows. My arms ached. My feet hurt. But the room looked beautiful. By 10 o'clock, guests began arriving. Everything ran smoothly. Nobody mentioned the missing florist. Nobody knew there had ever been a problem. Which was exactly how I preferred it. Around noon, I slipped into the kitchen for coffee. The scent of roasted beans wrapped around me like a blanket. I had barely taken my first sip when a familiar voice spoke behind me. You left the estate at 2 in the morning. I nearly dropped the cup. Damien stood in the doorway. I stared at him. How do you know that? A faint smile appeared. I own the security reports. Of course he did. Heat crept into my cheeks. It was not a big deal. You drove 16 miles in the middle of the night. The luncheon needed flowers. His expression remained unreadable for several seconds. Then he glanced toward the ballroom. The guests complimented the arrangements all morning. I shrugged. That is nice. That is all you have to say? I laughed softly. What else should I say? Something shifted in his eyes. Not amusement. Not surprise. Respect. Genuine respect. It unsettled me more than any compliment could have. Most wealthy people I had encountered expected recognition for every generous act. Every donation. Every favor. Yet Damien seemed fascinated by the fact that I wanted none. The silence stretched between us. Comfortable somehow. Then another employee rushed into the kitchen carrying a tablet. Mr. Moretti, the investors from Chicago have arrived. Damien nodded. The moment broke. He turned toward the door before pausing. Grace. Yes? The next time you solve a problem for this estate, do not do it alone. Before I could answer, he disappeared down the hallway. I stood there holding my coffee long after he left. Because for the first time I understood what everyone else had missed. Damien Moretti was not impressed by obedience. He was impressed by character. And whether I liked it or not, he was beginning to see mine. The first snowfall of the season arrived 3 days later. Thin white flakes drifted past the estate windows, turning the gardens into something out of a postcard. Most people spent their lunch break inside near the fireplaces. I spent mine in my car. The heater rattled loudly as I drove across town towards St. Anne's Medical Center. The paper bag on the passenger seat held a turkey sandwich, 2 apples, and a slice of chocolate pie Ethan had requested during my last visit. The moment I stepped into his room, his face lit up. "Please tell me that pie is for me." I laughed. "I drove 12 miles in traffic for this pie. It is definitely for you." Ethan grinned and immediately reached for the bag. Watching him smile always made the world feel lighter. For an hour, we talked about everything except hospitals. Basketball. Movies. His plans for college. The future. Especially the future. Before leaving, I stopped by the billing office. The smile disappeared from my face the moment I saw the latest statement. Numbers stared back at me from the page. Cold. Unforgiving. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my purse before Ethan could notice. He deserved hope. Not worry. By the time I returned to Moretti Estate, dusk had settled across the property. Golden lights glowed through the mansion windows. The scent of cedarwood drifted through the entrance hall. Everything looked warm. Comfortable. Safe. Yet my mind remained trapped inside that billing office. I barely noticed the figure standing near the grand staircase until a familiar voice interrupted my thoughts. "You have been carrying the same expression for 20 minutes. I looked up. Damien stood beside the railing, one hand resting against polished oak. My heart skipped unexpectedly. "I did not realize you were timing me." A faint smile touched his lips. "I notice things." There was something dangerous about how simply he said it. Not threatening. Honest. I adjusted the strap of my bag. Long day. His gaze drifted briefly toward my purse. Toward the folded paperwork hidden inside. Then back to my face. "You visited someone." It was not a question. "My brother." Damien nodded slowly. "The hospital on Lexington Avenue." I stared at him. "Do you have someone following me?" The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "No." "Then how do you know?" "You always leave the estate on Tuesdays and Fridays. You return carrying hospital visitor stickers that you forget to remove." My hand immediately flew to my coat sleeve. There it was. Bright blue. Embarrassment flooded my cheeks. Damien laughed softly. The sound surprised me. It was becoming easier to forget the intimidating reputation attached to his name. Easier to see the man underneath it. "His name is Ethan," I admitted. "He has been through a lot." Something thoughtful crossed Damien's expression. "He is lucky to have you." The words hit harder than they should have. Nobody had said that to me in years. Not because they were untrue. Because nobody had noticed. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Snow continued falling beyond the tall windows. The estate felt strangely quiet. Then Damien looked toward the darkening sky and said something that stayed with me long after he walked away. The people who care for everyone else are usually the ones nobody remembers to care for. And for the first time since I had met him, I wondered if Damien Moretti understood loneliness far better than he ever allowed anyone to see. The invitation arrived the following evening. I was polishing silver in the servants' hall when Mrs. Whitaker appeared beside me carrying a small cream-colored envelope. The moment I saw the embossed Moretti seal, my stomach tightened. "What is that?" I asked. "A message for you." She handed it over with an expression I could not read. Curious. Concerned. Maybe both. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single card written in neat black ink. Dinner. 8 o'clock. Main dining room. DM. I read it twice before looking up. This has to be a mistake. Mrs. Whitaker folded her arms. Mr. Moretti does not make many mistakes. Word traveled through the estate faster than winter wind. By 7 o'clock, every servant seemed to know about the invitation. Some looked excited for me. Others looked worried. A few looked openly shocked. I could hardly blame them. Employees did not have dinner in the main dining room. Not with Damien Moretti. The entire situation felt impossible. Yet at 7:55, I found myself standing outside the grand dining room wearing the nicest dress I owned. It was simple. Navy blue. Nothing remarkable. But it was clean, pressed, and the best I could manage. The double doors stood partially open. Warm light spilled across the marble floor. I took a slow breath and stepped inside. The room looked different without a crowd. Candles flickered along the length of the massive table. Snow drifted quietly beyond the tall windows. The enormous chandelier cast soft gold reflections across polished wood. Damien sat alone near the center. Not at the head of the table. Beside it. As though he had intentionally removed some invisible barrier between us. He stood when I entered. The gesture surprised me. Grace. Mr. Moretti. A faint smile appeared. Tonight, Damien is fine. I laughed nervously. That might take some practice. He pulled out a chair for me. I hesitated before sitting. The entire evening felt unreal. A server appeared briefly with dinner before disappearing again, leaving the room strangely private. For several minutes, we spoke about ordinary things. The snowfall. The estate. Books. Music. Topics that felt almost absurdly normal considering who he was. What surprised me most was how easy it became. Damien listened. Really listened. Most wealthy people waited for their turn to speak. Damien paid attention to every answer as if it mattered. At one point, he asked about Ethan. I told him about my brother's dream of studying engineering one day. About his determination. About the way he never stopped smiling despite everything life had thrown at him. Damien listened quietly. Then he asked, "And what about your dream?" The question caught me completely off guard. I stared at him. My dream? Yes. I looked down at my plate. The answer should have been simple. Yet nobody had asked me that question in years. Somewhere along the way, my dreams had become secondary to bills, responsibilities, and survival. I am not sure anymore, I admitted softly. The honesty hung between us. Damien's expression softened. Not with pity. Understanding. Then perhaps it is time you remembered. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Snow continued falling outside. Candles flickered gently. And sitting across from the most powerful man I had ever met, I realized this dinner was not really about food at all. It was about something far more dangerous. He was beginning to know me. And I was beginning to know him. The snow had stopped by morning, leaving the estate wrapped in a blanket of white that reflected the pale winter sunlight. Everything looked peaceful. Too peaceful. Because ever since that dinner, my thoughts had become impossible to organize. I kept replaying Damien's question. What is your dream? Nobody had asked me that in years. Not because people were cruel. Because life had become practical. Dreams did not pay hospital bills. Dreams did not keep roofs over people's heads. Dreams became luxuries somewhere along the way. 3 days passed before I saw Damien again. During those 3 days, I threw myself into work. Laundry schedules. Inventory reports. Event preparation. Anything that kept my mind occupied. It did not help. By Friday afternoon, I was arranging books in the West Library when I heard his voice behind me. You have been avoiding me. The book nearly slipped from my hands. I turned slowly. Damien stood near the doorway wearing a charcoal overcoat dusted with melting snowflakes. I have been working. You always work. His answer made my heart stumble. Because he was right. I looked away first. Should I not? He walked farther into the room. That is not what I asked. Silence settled between us. The library felt smaller than usual. The fire crackled softly inside the stone hearth. Outside, bare branches swayed against gray skies. Finally, I sighed. You asked me a question the other night. Damien nodded once. And? And I did not like the answer. His expression shifted. Curious. Concerned. Why? I stared at the shelf surrounding us. Thousands of books. Thousands of stories. Every one of them filled with people who knew where they were going. I envied that certainty. Because I realized I stopped thinking about myself a long time ago. The confession surprised even me. Once the words started coming, they refused to stop. When my parents died, everything changed. Ethan needed help. The bills kept coming. Every decision became about responsibility. My voice softened. Eventually, I stopped asking what I wanted. Damien remained completely still. Listening. The way he always listened. And what did you want? He asked quietly. I laughed without humor. I wanted college. The words felt strange after all these years. I wanted to study architecture. His eyebrows lifted slightly. Architecture? I nodded. I used to draw buildings constantly. Bridges. Skylines. Historic houses. I smiled faintly at the memory. I was good at it too. What happened? The answer was simple. Life happened. Yet somehow saying it out loud hurt more than I expected. I chose what was necessary instead. For several seconds, Damien said nothing. Then he crossed the room and stopped beside a tall window overlooking the snow-covered grounds. My father used to tell me that responsibility is important. I looked at him. That sounds reasonable. His gaze remained fixed outside. He also said responsibility becomes dangerous when it is the only thing you allow yourself to be. The words landed somewhere deep inside me. Because for the first time I realized he was not really talking about me. He was talking about himself. When he finally turned back toward me, something vulnerable flickered behind his calm expression. Only for a second. Then it disappeared. But it was enough. Enough to remind me that behind the reputation, the wealth, and the power stood a man carrying burdens of his own. And for the first time I found myself wondering what dreams Damien Moretti had sacrificed along the way. The sound of laughter caught my attention before I even entered the east courtyard. It was unusual. Moretti Estate was many things, but loud laughter was not one of them. Most days moved with quiet efficiency. Staff worked. Executives hurried between meetings. Guests came and went beneath chandeliers and polished ceilings. Yet this afternoon felt different. Curious, I stepped through the stone archway and immediately stopped. Damien stood near the fountain surrounded by several employees. Gardeners. Drivers. Maintenance staff. People who normally kept a respectful distance. One of the older groundskeepers was telling a story about getting lost during a fishing trip 20 years earlier. The group burst into laughter. To my complete surprise, Damien laughed too. Not politely. Not because he felt obligated. Genuinely. The sound carried across the courtyard. Warm. Relaxed. Human. For a moment, nobody noticed me standing there. I simply watched. The man everyone described as intimidating looked nothing like the rumors. He looked comfortable. Almost happy. Then his eyes found mine. The smile remained. Grace. Every head turned. Suddenly I felt far more exposed than I wanted to. Sorry, I said. I did not mean to interrupt. You are not interrupting anything. Damien glanced toward an empty chair near the fountain. Join us. The invitation stunned the entire group almost as much as it stunned me. I could see it on their faces. Yet nobody argued. After a brief hesitation, I sat down. The conversation resumed naturally. Stories flowed back and forth. Memories. Embarrassing mistakes. Holiday disasters. For nearly 40 minutes, nobody discussed business. Nobody discussed money. They simply enjoyed each other's company. Eventually the others returned to work, leaving Damien and me alone beside the fountain. Water trickled softly over stone. Winter sunlight reflected against the surface like scattered diamonds. I glanced at him. You seem different lately. His eyebrow lifted. Different? Happier. The word slipped out before I could stop it. Damien looked toward the fountain. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he surprised me again. You are not the first person to say that. My pulse quickened slightly. And what do you think? A faint smile touched his lips. I think they might be right. The answer lingered between us. Gentle. Honest. Dangerous. Because part of me understood exactly why people were noticing a change. I had seen it myself. Damien spent more time with staff. More time listening. More time outside his office. The walls surrounding him seemed lower somehow. As though he had finally stopped carrying every burden alone. The silence stretched comfortably. Then his expression grew thoughtful. Do you know what I wanted to be when I was 18? I shook my head. An architect. I stared at him. Certain I had misheard. You are joking. I am not. His smile widened slightly at my reaction. I spent an entire summer sketching buildings. For a second, neither of us spoke. The coincidence felt almost impossible. Then we both laughed. Not because it was funny. Because somehow it explained everything. The conversations. The understanding. The strange feeling that he saw parts of me others overlooked. As the afternoon light faded across the estate grounds, I realized something important. The distance between us had not disappeared. He was still Damien Moretti. I was still Grace Parker. Yet somehow, little by little, the gap felt smaller than it had the day we first met. The first sign that something had changed was not Damien. It was everyone else. Conversation stopped when I entered rooms. Employees exchanged glances they thought I did not notice. Invitations that had once seemed impossible had become normal enough to spark rumors throughout the estate. I tried to ignore it. I focused on work. On Ethan. On keeping my life simple. Unfortunately, life had other plans. It happened on a gray Monday afternoon. A charity planning committee had gathered in one of the estate's conference rooms. My job was simple. Deliver refreshments. Collect empty cups. Leave. I had done it dozens of times before. The meeting was already underway when I entered. Several executives sat around the long table reviewing proposals. Damien occupied his usual seat near the window. His attention remained fixed on a stack of documents. Everything felt ordinary until one of the guests recognized me. You are Grace Parker, correct? I paused. Yes. The woman smiled politely. The employee Mr. Moretti seems to speak about rather often. Heat rushed into my face. Around the table, a few people exchanged knowing looks. Someone chuckled softly. I immediately wished the floor would open beneath me. Before I could respond, another guest leaned back in his chair. You must be very special. The words sounded harmless. Yet something about the tone made me uncomfortable. I lowered my eyes toward the coffee tray. I am just doing my job. Of course, the man replied. Still, it is unusual. The room grew quieter. I knew exactly what he meant. Not special. Unusual. A servant receiving attention she had not earned. The familiar sting settled in my chest. For years, I had learned how to smile through moments like this. How to pretend they did not hurt. I placed the final coffee cup on the table and prepared to leave. Then Damien spoke. The unusual thing is not grace. Every voice stopped. His tone remained calm. Controlled. Yet the room immediately listened. Damien set down his pen and looked directly at the man. The unusual thing is how many successful people still judge others by job titles. Silence followed. Heavy and complete. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The executive cleared his throat awkwardly. I did not mean, I know exactly what you meant. Damien's voice never rose. Somehow that made the words even stronger. He glanced toward me briefly before returning his attention to the room. Character matters more than status. Integrity matters more than position. Anyone who does not understand that should reconsider what success actually means. The meeting continued a few moments later. Conversations resumed. Papers shuffled. Yet nothing felt the same. I left the room carrying an empty tray and a heart beating far too fast. Later that evening, snow began falling again. I stood near the estate entrance watching flakes drift beneath the lantern lights when Damien appeared beside me. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally I looked at him. You did not have to do that. He slipped his hands into his coat pockets. Yes, I did. The answer came without hesitation. I stared out at the falling snow. Why? Damien's gaze remained fixed on the dark driveway ahead. When he finally answered, his voice was quiet enough that I almost missed it. Because the people worth defending are usually the ones who never ask for it. And standing there beneath the winter sky, I realized something neither of us had said aloud yet. This was no longer simply friendship. Something far deeper was beginning to grow between us. The call came just after 7 in the morning. I was halfway through organizing supply orders when my phone vibrated inside my apron pocket. The moment I saw the hospital number, my stomach dropped. Nurses do not call family members that early unless something changes. My hand shook as I answered. By the time the conversation ended, I was already grabbing my coat. Ethan had experienced complications during the night. Nothing life-threatening, they assured me, but he would need additional treatment and a longer stay than expected. The drive to St. Anne's felt twice as long as usual. Gray clouds covered the sky. Traffic crawled through the city. Every red light felt personal. When I finally reached the hospital, Ethan greeted me with his usual smile, but I could see the exhaustion behind it. We spent the morning talking about everything except medical charts. He joked about hospital food. I pretended not to worry. Both of us knew we were acting. After lunch, I stepped into the hallway to speak with one of the financial coordinators. The numbers she showed me made my chest tighten. Additional treatment meant additional expenses. More paperwork. More bills. More months of trying to stretch every dollar further than it should go. I thanked her politely and walked toward the parking garage feeling completely drained. The winter wind stung my face the moment I stepped outside. For several minutes, I simply sat inside my car without starting the engine. I stared through the windshield at nothing. For the first time in years, I felt tired in a way sleep could not fix. The sound of a knock against the passenger window startled me. I turned and froze. Damien stood outside the car. Snowflakes drifted across the shoulders of his dark coat. For a second, I genuinely wondered if I was imagining him. I lowered the window. What are you doing here? He looked almost amused. I could ask you the same question, but I already know the answer. My heart stumbled. You followed me? No. He glanced toward the hospital entrance. I was attending a board meeting upstairs. Somehow that felt entirely believable. Damien seemed connected to every important institution in the city. He studied my expression carefully. Something happened. It was not a question. I looked away. Ethan needs more treatment. Saying the words aloud made everything feel heavier. Damien opened the passenger door and sat down without asking. Surprisingly, I did not mind. The silence that followed felt comforting rather than awkward. Finally, I laughed softly. I am supposed to be the optimistic one. Then stop trying so hard. I turned toward him. Damien's gaze remained steady. You do not have to carry every burden alone, Grace. The words hit harder than he could possibly know. Because that was exactly what I had been doing for years. Carrying everything. Alone. I stared down at my hands. Sometimes I do not know any other way. Damien was quiet for several seconds. Then he said something that changed the entire afternoon. Neither did I. For the first time since I had met him, there was no distance in his voice. No titles. No walls. Just honesty. And sitting beside him in a hospital parking garage beneath a gray winter sky, I realized that whatever existed between us had already become too important to ignore. For the next week, something remained unspoken between us. Not because we were avoiding it. Because neither of us seemed ready to give it a name. Winter settled deeper across the estate. Snow covered the gardens. The fountain stood silent beneath thin sheets of ice. Yet despite the cold, I found myself looking forward to every conversation with Damien. That frightened me more than I wanted to admit. One evening, I returned from the hospital later than usual. Ethan was improving, but recovery was slow. By the time I reached Moretti Estate, most of the lights had already dimmed. The mansion felt unusually quiet. As I stepped into the entrance hall, I noticed several unfamiliar luxury vehicles parked outside. A meeting was underway. Important people. Important decisions. The kind of world Damien belonged to long before I entered his life. I started toward the servants' wing when I heard raised voices drifting from a nearby conference room. Not angry. Intense. Through the partially open doorway, I caught a glimpse of executives seated around a polished table. Damien stood at the far end reviewing documents. One of the men spoke firmly. You are risking too much time on things that do not benefit the company. Another nodded. Your priorities have changed. The room fell silent. Damien remained calm. Perhaps they have. The answer surprised everyone, including me. A woman seated near the window folded her arms. You built this organization by making practical decisions. Damien looked down briefly before answering. Practical decisions are not always the right ones. Something about those words stopped me cold. Because I knew he was not talking about business anymore. I quietly moved away before anyone noticed me listening. Yet the conversation stayed with me all night. The next afternoon, Damien asked me to join him for a walk through the estate grounds. Fresh snow crunched beneath our boots as we followed a path winding through the gardens. The sky above us was pale blue. For several minutes neither of us spoke. Finally, Damien stopped beside a frozen reflecting pool. There is something I need to tell you. My pulse immediately quickened. He looked out across the snow-covered landscape. For most of my life, every decision was easy. I waited. Not because the choices were simple. Because I always chose responsibility first. The words felt familiar. They echoed our earlier conversations. He turned toward me. Then you arrived. My breath caught. Damien laughed softly, almost at himself. You challenged everything I thought mattered. The winter air suddenly felt thinner. Damien. He shook his head gently. Let me finish. His expression softened in a way I had never seen before. No walls. No distance. No titles. Just honesty. You reminded me there are things more important than power. More important than expectations. Snow drifted slowly around us. The world seemed impossibly still. Then he said the words that changed everything. If I have to choose between protecting what I built and protecting what we have become, I already know my answer. My heart hammered against my ribs. Because in that moment, standing beside the frozen reflecting pool, I realized Damien Moretti had already made his choice. And somehow, without noticing when it happened, I had made mine too. Spring arrived quietly. The snow disappeared from the estate grounds. The gardens awakened beneath warmer sunlight. New leaves appeared on branches that had seemed lifeless only weeks earlier. Everything felt different. Not because the world had changed. Because we had. Ethan was finally discharged from the hospital on a bright April morning. I still remember watching him walk through the front doors carrying a backpack and an enormous smile. For the first time in months, he looked like a teenager instead of a patient. Freedom suited him. Hope suited him even more. That evening, Moretti Estate hosted a small gathering unlike any event I had seen before. No investors. No executives. No important guests seeking favors. Just employees, friends, and people who had become family over the years. String lights hung across the gardens. Music drifted through the warm evening air. Laughter echoed between flowering trees. It felt less like a formal event and more like a celebration of life itself. I stood near the fountain watching Ethan challenge several gardeners to a game of cornhole when Damien appeared beside me. Some things had changed. Others never did. My heartbeat still noticed him before the rest of me did. He followed my gaze toward Ethan. He looks happy. I smiled. He is. Damien nodded slowly. So are you. The words settled gently between us. For once, I did not argue. Because he was right. Somewhere along the way, the weight I had carried for years had become lighter. Not because my problems disappeared. Because I no longer faced them alone. The evening continued around us. Employees who once lowered their eyes now greeted Damien openly. He greeted them back by name. Watching him, I remembered the man I had first met in the dining hall months earlier. Powerful. Distant. Untouchable. That man still existed. But now there was more. Compassion. Warmth. Humanity. The transformation had not happened overnight. It had happened one conversation at a time. One choice at a time. One act of kindness at a time. Damien reached into his jacket pocket and handed me a folded envelope. My brow furrowed. What is this? Open it. Inside was a letter from the architecture program at a respected university. I stared at the page in confusion. Then disbelief. Then shock. My eyes widened as I read the words. Acceptance. Scholarship. Opportunity. The dream I had buried years ago suddenly sat in my hands. I looked up at him. Speechless. How? Damien smiled softly. You did the hard part years ago. You earned it. Emotion tightened my throat. For several seconds, I could not speak. Finally, I laughed through tears I had not expected. You remembered. I remember everything important. Around us, the celebration continued. Music drifted through the night air. Lanterns glowed beneath the trees. Ethan waved enthusiastically from across the lawn. And for the first time in my life, the future felt bigger than responsibility. Bigger than fear. Bigger than survival. Damien gently took my hand. Not because he wanted to rescue me. Because he wanted to walk beside me. As the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, I realized the greatest change was not that a powerful man had opened his heart. It was that two people from completely different worlds had taught each other the same lesson. A title can open doors. Money can build empires. But only kindness can build a home. And sometimes the person who changes your life forever is the one everyone else overlooked.